I spent a couple of years after we lost Mitch, and I mean, just a tiny little fraction of the story because the listeners won't have read the book, but we don't know what happened to my son. My son died in a house with his best friend. They've been best friends for years in his mother's house, at a time shortly before she was to be home. So it was just a normal day, a Tuesday afternoon, August 2013. And basically, it was a small town in Alabama, and these.
Welcome to Self-Helpful. I'm your guide, Kevin Miller, and I curate the sea of new personal development messages to bring the most influential leaders onto this show. Join me as I question my guests to better understand their counsel so we can all integrate the wisdom into our lives, because we all want to elevate our own experience and improve the way we show up for others. The Self-Helpful Podcast is presented by Ziglar, your premier source for equipping coaches. Visit Ziglar.com. In this episode, how to recover from loss and pain that you will never get over. We all have trauma, pain, and disappointment that affects us, from massive life-threatening events to emotional scars to the loss of a dream. And we tend to judge and minimize our pains. But a point of this episode is, if you have a pain, regardless of what level, it just is. And you'll never fully get over it. But it will either hamper you, or you can look at it as, well, hey, that was a bummer, but how can I use it to help me? Which is the point. Though we do get on a soapbox about not just justifying anything. I mean, we can find some redemption, which is, again, is much the point of the episode, but we aren't going to sugarcoat that it makes up for everything with some tidy little bow. My guest on this topic is Dr. Lee Warren. Lee is a war veteran, an author, a podcaster, and an active brain surgeon. He forever impacted how I view my personal faith. The first time I had him on the show for his book called I've Seen the End of You, where Lee grapples with having faith in miracles and hope while looking at someone's brain scan and some tumor and knowing the person's going to die. Well, this time we're talking about his new book. It's called Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. Lee is an expert here because on August 20th, 2013, his 19-year-old son, Mitch, died of multiple stab wounds to the neck. Mitch's best friend died along with him with one stab wound. And whether the knife used to kill Mitch was in his hand or someone else's, whether he was at fault or a victim, they will never know. It's literally an unsolved murder. And this could have been the end of Lee, or as you're about to hear, he has moved on to a degree, not without scars, not getting over it, but finding some redemption. And he lays out how you can too. Lee, you're not the first guest I've had back on the show. So I always enjoy having some history with people, but I got to admit, I feel like a special spirit of history with you. Your first book, or not the first book, but the one that when I had you on the show, I've Seen the End of You, has continued to be significant to me. And the times that I bring it up with friends or on the show and talk about this guy who wrote a book, he's a brain surgeon, and him being a man of faith and knowing, God can do anything and we should pray for miracles. And yet he's looking at the brain scan and he sees what's in there and he's saying, dude, you are going to die. And the difficulty of that just resonated, always has with my heart. And so to have you back on is just a special treat. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so good to be back with you, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
I have key points, as I always do, and I generally tend to go after the points, that I want to hit on. However, as a lead-in, I mean, this story is so much about your story, about the loss of your son that I knew of through the first book, through the last book. I've Seen the End of You, but not to this level of depth. And as I think about that now, you are now 8 years. Is that right? 8 or 9 years
Yeah, it's
since
almost 10 now. Yeah,
almost 10 since Mitch died. And as you say in the book, when something happens to you, when that trauma, that massive thing happens, you do not ever go back.
that's
You
right.
are you are not the same. What is today? What's the most tangible difference that you would say this is what has changed in me? I know there's a lot. That's a big question, and maybe it's even a day by day thing. That yesterday it felt like it would have been a different answer. Last week, last year, today, the last pain you felt, the most recent one with Mitch, whether it was a minute ago or this morning or last night or whatever. What? How would you define it?
Wow. So I think that the number one thing is, and I think everybody in my family would say this, like we have no more um, naivete around the fact that life can bring you something horrible that you weren't expecting. Like that everybody thinks it's not going to happen to them, right? We were this, you know, solid Christian family, try to do things right and, you know, work hard and all that stuff. And then my son gets stabbed to death, and that's not supposed to happen in my world. And which is kind of silly as a neurosurgeon, because I see people every day that fall off the skateboard and hit their head and their son dies, or, you know, somebody forgets to fasten a seatbelt and they die, or get a fatal brain cancer. I see it all the time. And even my own brother lost a child when he, you know, 23 years ago. And so I don't know why I thought it was never going to happen to me. Um, but I did. And so then I said, I think that's the number one thing, Kevin, is just this idea that, you need to live your life with the knowledge that stuff that you think you need can be taken from you. And so it would be wise to build your life around things that can't be taken from you. So I think that's number one. And the
Wow.
second part of your question was, when's the last time something broke me open? And it's funny to say this after 10 years, but day before yesterday, I was leaving the hospital. I get my phone out to call my wife and check in with her. And I've never been able to delete Mitch's contact from my phone. I just can't do it. He's still on the favorites, and the phone number belongs to somebody else now. But somehow I must have punched that, and it was up on the screen. So I pulled my phone out of my pocket, and there's Mitch's face and his number. And for a nanosecond, I said, I need to call Mitch. Like, he's been gone for 10 years, and my heart as a dad was still ready to call him. And then when you go, wait a minute, that's when it just busts open again. And I'm walking in my truck crying, you know, like, God, how can I do that after 10 years? But it still happens.
How different would it have been, or what is the difference? Would it have been if he had been like one of your patients, let's say a brain tumor? Okay, so he's not. So go back those 10 years, and you discovered, oh my gosh, my son has a brain tumor. You go through what you're used to going through. You have some time. You grieve. You know, there's some wrap up. There's some
Right.
finality there, and then the day comes, and his heart stops beating, and he's gone. How how different would it be, or would it be different in your overall feelings now, 10 years later, than him being the victim of you know, being stabbed in the neck and being gone? Um,
You
is
know,
it?
it's a tricky question because you don't really know. But I mean, I just wrote a book about it. I've done extensive research into what happens to people after they go through these massive things, as we call them: trauma, tragedy, difficulties,
Yeah.
diagnoses, all these big things that happen to everybody. And in fact, I thought before I wrote up seeing the interview, I thought that it would be easier for me if I had known it was coming. I
Mm-hmm.
thought that. But I have had conversations with, interviews with, become friends with probably 100 or more sets of bereaved parents over the years since we lost Mitch. And most recently, a good friend of ours um, lost a boy who they knew from the day he was born that he was going to need a heart transplant. And he
Yeah.
made it 12 years. And he finally got to the point where they said, hey, you got to have a heart. And he got one, and he died because of the transplant didn't work.
Wow.
And so And I can tell you from talking to them, it wasn't easier for them. And so I think the real answer is we want to say, if only this had happened or that had happened, it would
Yeah.
have been easier for me. But I think the truth is, nothing's easier when you lose somebody or when that massive thing happens to you. Nothing makes everybody's grief is individualistic for them at the time that they're having it, and I don't think you can measure it against somebody else's.
Well, so let me go down that road with now again, yours is unique in that now I even said Mitch, a victim of the stabbing. And the truth is, as you talk about in the book, you will never know. You would
That's right.
assume that he was a victim. He got stabbed in the neck, but he got stabbed, multiple stab wounds in the neck. His friend who was there also dead from one stabbing, and
Yeah.
whether he was a victim or a perpetrator, which you can't even wrap your head around, but
No.
you'll never know how. Well, again, maybe it's still kind of the same question. Does that still make it worse without being able to have it reconciled? Would there be, I mean, of course you want to think the best of him. So if you got news right now, God sent a stone tablet down and said, hey, just so you know,
Yeah.
Mitch was a victim. He didn't do anything wrong. Of course, that's got to feel better than if you heard, yeah, he flipped out and stabbed a guy or something like that. But that need to reconcile is what I'm interested in.
That again, you're we're diving right in here, buddy. It's awesome. I think I spent a couple of years after we lost Mitch, and I mean, just a tiny little fraction of the story because the listeners won't have read the book, but we don't know what happened to my son. My son died in a house with his best friend. They've been best friends for years in his mother's house. At a time shortly before she was to be home. So it was just a normal day, a Tuesday afternoon, August 2013. And basically, it was a small town in Alabama, and these police officers went in and found these two boys, and there were three knives in the house that had blood on them. One was in a different room. Mitch had an accident a couple of weeks before and had broken his right hand, which was his dominant hand. So it was in a cast, right? And so Mitch had multiple stab wounds, 8 wounds. The other boy had 1. They both died. Mitch's body was close to one of the knives, and the other boy wasn't. And so the police said, oh, he must have killed that guy and then killed himself. Case over. They cleaned the crime scene, took the bodies out, didn't call for investigators, didn't call the FBI or the State Bureau of Investigation. They were in the house less than an hour and made the determination of what they thought happened. And then drug screens come back and nobody's had alcohol, nobody's had drugs. These are two good kids. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So the bottom line of that is we had to come to grips with the fact that there was a story here that we never going to get to know. That the police cleaned it. It was impossible unless some third party comes forward and confesses to this crime. Like, we'll never know what really happened. Did my son have some kind of mental breakdown? Was there a fight? Was there a girl they were fighting? We won't ever get to know that. And so after a while, Lisa and I, we had to make a decision. Are we going to be these people that go on crusades to try to find this answer and demand the truth and all that stuff? Or are we going to just accept? So the bottom line is this, that we had to make a decision as to whether we were going to live our lives wrecked by this unknowable thing, or if we were going to just have to come to grips with the fact that we lost our son and we had to heal from that and move on and try to put our lives back together in some meaningful way. And so I don't think, I've said it to God a million times, tell me what happened. I want to know what happened. But at the same time, I don't really think it would make me feel any better, because at the end of the day, you wake up tomorrow and one of your kids' bedroom is empty because they're buried somewhere. I don't think it feels better if they were, trying to save somebody from a house fire, or if they died of brain cancer, or if they got hit by a car. I don't think you really feel better about the fact that they're gone. You may be able to build a story that makes it noble in some way or something like that, but I don't think it changes how you grieve.
That was my question, Lee. That's what I'm looking at. So for all of us, as you say in the book, all of us have something that is massive to us. And I want to,
Yep.
I want to break that down a little bit too. What is massive, but we'll come to that in a second. We all have a hurt. We all have a pain. We all have a
Yep.
trauma. We all have a loss. We all have a something that now that you have one that's in an exaggerated way, very massive, you're a decade past it. Is it fair? Is it realistic somewhat to look at it and to say, whatever your thing is, as you call it, your master thing, whatever that is, the details around it really don't matter. And they're probably just causing you more grief. The loss is a loss. Like you said, no matter what happened, no matter what's reconciled, no matter what's just or unjust, like the police not doing an investigation that now can't ever be redone. No matter that, nothing will change the fact that your pain is because you had a son and now that bedroom is empty and it always will be. And I think what I'm coming to is, does it help? Would you say to people, would you counsel to say, let the details go? They're just going to make it worse. Focus on what the pain is. That is it. Deal with that and don't let the other stuff make it even more difficult to get through.
Well, I don't know if it can be that simplified. I
Okay.
wish it could be. Gabor Mate has written about this, about trauma. We've always thought trauma is what happened to you. And what we understand from the brain now is that trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what the reaction to it that you have, right? That's what you can fix. You can't fix the thing that happened to you. And so I would just say to the listener that has gone through some major things, somebody raped you or somebody robbed you or somebody divorced you or somebody did this thing or you developed this diagnosis or whatever it was that happened to you. I'm not trying to say that the events around that don't play into your neuroscience and the way that you grieve and the way that you recover. What I am trying to say is this, that you have a journey ahead of you for the rest of your life that has to be managed. And your question that you have to ask yourself, I came to this question like, am I going to be a person who lost his son and that's all I'm ever going to be again? Because I kept running into these people who, and I studied them for years. I'm a good scientist. I'm a good doctor. So I try to, how do I watch what other people do and learn from it so I can put my life back together now and help my family? And what I learned is that there are people who become defined by the thing that happened to them. And their life can never be about anything other than that. You've known somebody that, how are you doing today? Well, I'm sad because 35 years ago, this thing happened. And that's okay. You can be that way. But I wanted to still be a good dad, a good husband. I've got 4 other children. I've got 4 grandkids now. And I wanted to figure out how to not be that person who just has that thing that happened, that massive thing. And I didn't want it to define me. I didn't feel like God was calling me to be defined by that. And I had to just figure out how to do that.
Okay. I got two things I'm curious about in that. One is you related it in the same way that I would, because I've had these discussions. I mean, back to what you said a minute ago, Lee. Yeah, I've got to the point of feeling like it's arrogant for me to think that couldn't happen to me.
Yeah.
And I think it's more acute to me because I've got 9 kids. My odds are higher of something happening, of me witnessing the death of a child before I go. And yet if one were to die, my first thought would be, well, I've got all these others to care for. So now speak to those who are listening who don't, who say, man, they've got one person. And if that person dies, they've got nothing. That's the feeling. I want to hit on that or get your thoughts on that. Where would you tend to have gone? Go.
Yeah, I've seen that.
I figured.
Your video went away. Did I lose you?
Oh, no, I'm still here. You lost my video, huh? Well, let me make a timestamp. Are you still not getting it?
Yeah, I hear your audio, but I just was afraid that I lost you there, but I just can't see your face. But so I've seen that before, in the setting of people with glioblastoma whose spouses were the ones who were wrecked by the thing, because the patient is dying and the spouse, in a couple of instances, they didn't have children and really their whole life had been built around their marriage. Right. And so I've seen people who had to come to grips with the one thing that they thought they would always have, they no longer have.
Yeah. Lee, are you seeing me yet?
Nope. There's a little K and then like a Wi-Fi type. There you are.
Now
You're back.
I have no idea why.
I don't either.
Okay. Well, let me make a timestamp again. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All right. Here we'll pick up again. Well, the other piece of that, to you saying, I don't want to be the guy where that, that's who I am, the guy whose son died. Yeah. You talk about that later on in the book where you say when your pain becomes an idol. Yeah. Unpack that for us.
Well, something I just thought of when you were saying that, before I get to the idol part, like I remember one of the things that helped me turn around, Kevin, was a few months after Mitch died, there was another surgeon. I didn't put this in the book. There was another surgeon that I wasn't really friends with. I just was I knew him. He knew me. We didn't ever socialize or anything, but he came up to me one day. It was the most interesting thing. And he's kind of a rough and tumble kind of, outdoor guy. And he put his hands on my shoulders, kind of braced me and looked right in my eye. And he said, I don't know what to say to you, but I just know this. Your son wouldn't want one event to have a 200% mortality rate.
Wow.
He wouldn't want you to die too. And you got to live to honor him. And it was like the most profound thing somebody said to me. It's one of the side trips into this conversation will probably be like, what are some of the things you ought not to say to people when something bad happens? That was a really good thing to say. Like, I don't know what to say. It's really hard, but you can't die because Mitch wouldn't want you to die. And I was like, holy cow, that's exactly what I needed to hear. So now in the context of that, like, it's so alluring, Kevin. It's so enticing to sit in the pain. And I can call it back to mind right now. There's a couple of songs I could play that Mitch liked, or I could look at. I sometimes did it for years, and I still do. I'll go into my photos and pull up the folder. I have pictures of him, and I can just put myself down in this spiral of memory and loss, and sit with him and try to somehow find this way down to where he is, and it metaphorically, this idea that I could somehow get sad enough to understand what he was going through when he died. And it's so enticing to do that because trauma kind of beckons us with this, like, you'll never feel better than this. Your life is over. There's no future for you. You're always going to be afraid of, the future now. And what happens is it's like an altar. Like you can sit there and put this thing that happened to you on the altar, and you can worship it, and it can become your entire universe. It can become all you think about, all you're known by. All your friends and family have to sort of, they know there's 4 or 5 days a year that they better call you, and they better, send a note, or you're going to be wrecked, and that sort of thing. And you can do that. And it's not always possible not to do that for some people, I think. But I just knew, especially after my friend said that to me, my colleague, that's not what God is calling us to in our lives. Like, we're not supposed to be focused on something that happened in the past to the extent that we can't live the life in the future that we still have. Because if your heart's still beating, like, there's some reason why you're still here. Yeah. And so I started thinking more in terms of, there's this passage in Hebrews chapter 12 that says, since then we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run the race, with faith, and cast off everything that hinders and easily entangles. And I started thinking about Mitch as one of those witnesses who's up there. And I would think, I actually had a lot of conversations with myself, like, oh, Mitch wouldn't want you to do that. And like, oh, he's going, yeah, Dad, do that. That's a good thing. Do that. And so I started, like, sometimes having these little fantasies in my mind about what he would be proud of me for. And so then I thought, well, maybe instead of letting his death define me and wreck me and ruin me, maybe I let it better me. And there's this passage in Isaiah that says, I've refined you, not like silver is refined, but I've refined you in the furnace of suffering. And so that these God's saying to this prophet that I put you in a situation and I burned you up and you came out of it on the other side somehow bettered. And that's one of those things that you can't process early on after grief, because it's one of those, it sounds like one of those platitudes, like people say, oh, it's, all things work together for the good of those that love the Lord, right? Romans 8:28. Terrible thing to say to somebody right after they lose a child. But the bottom line is this, that at some point it became missional for me. It became important for me to try to make the rest of my life one that tells a story that Mitch would be proud of. And that felt like a goal that I could shoot at that would help me to recover, because I was trying to do something to sort of take the story of my life and make it a notable one for his benefit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does. And gosh, I find myself, Lee, wanting to, this is why I love getting to do this show, because this is what I'd ask you if we were sitting over drinks right now, to think, because I think about this. I literally do. I'm not morbid with it, but I that's my perspective. Is it's arrogant for me to think that I will outlive every one of my children. I remember my grandfather weeping to me when he had a child die. He says, nobody should ever have to see the loss of their child. And I remember that starkly there. And now here I am with a lot of children, and goodness, it's not like I'm expecting one of them to die, but I just think there's a higher possibility. How do I prepare for that? How do I look at that? My thought is, and it comes along with some things that I've been reading and studying, is some aspect of letting go in regards to attachment. That can I look at that kid and appreciate my history with them, their birth, everything that I've experienced with them, the person that they are now, that is, and I've got older kids like you do now, that they are separate. They're leading separate lives. But can I do that? And can I let go? And is that a way to do it? To somehow, they're a person, and I'm their father, and we do have an attachment, but to somewhat unattach I don't even know. I get there's where the question is. That's what I'm grappling with. What would you counsel me in?
I don't think so. I don't think detachment and lowering of expectations is the pathway to happiness. So, Dennis Prager wrote about that in his book about happiness, which is a good book. But he basically said the perfect path to happiness is to not ever expect anything to work out the way you thought it would.
Which is terrible. That's horrific. I can never go. Yeah, the secret to happiness is just lower your expectations.
Man, it'd be great if all 9 of your kids made it to their whole life, but if it doesn't, it's okay. They were good kids. You just can't. I mean, that's unrealistic, right? Nobody's like that. And I've seen in Iraq, when I was there in the war, back in 2004 and 2005, like I've seen adults who never expect their kids to live to adulthood because they live in war their whole life. And it's so common for 2 or 3 of your kids to die. You have enough kids, you hope 1 or 2 of them make it to adulthood. And those people, they have a different kind of peace of mind and happiness than we do. Like they don't expect everything to go well for them. Right. And so that was an aside, but I think that I just don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is this, and this is why, in fact, a little distinction between I've seen the interview in this book, Hope is the First Dose, is this. I've seen the interview, I told you a story of my work with people with brain tumors and people who were dying, and trying to understand how to help them when I couldn't fix them with surgery, and how to help people find hope in hopeless situations. And then as I was thinking I knew enough to write that book, that's when Mitch died. And then basically I wrote the book to say, I didn't know as much as I thought I did, and you really need to find faith because you don't have anything else once you lose the things you think you know. And so that book is memoir, and it's about what happened and kind of tells you that we made it. This book I see as my prescription to you as a doctor to say, here's how we did that, and here's how you can do it too. And that's why I was so vulnerable and open in the first of it, is to just, you need to understand what it's like to lose a child and go down in that hole with me, so that I can then show you how we figured it out, right? How for us, this treatment plan that we put together for ourselves, and you're going to have to put one together too. That being said, I think the answer is more along the lines of, don't not expect your kids to survive, but also understand this very important piece. When I researched how people respond to major things that happen to them in their lives, I figured out that the number one fact, and we can talk about all those different groups of people if you want to later, but the number one thing that separates people who can go through hard things and find happiness and hope again from those who are wrecked by them is their ability to separate how their life feels to them from the circumstances that occur to them. So if you can learn how to separate your sense of hopefulness and resilience and purpose and all those things from the actual events of your life, which in other words, it means that you're building your life on stuff that you can't lose, that you're saying, I understand that massive things happen. I've got a plan in place for how I've responded to them when they occur. I'm going to be grieved like everyone is, and I'm going to be for a while sort of unanchored by this extraordinary thing that's happening. But then I'm going to, over time, trust the process that I'm going to be able to zoom out and see that these extraordinary things in each of our lives are ordinary things in all of our lives. And that sounds funny to say, but if you unpack it a little bit, it's true. If your son died tomorrow, Kevin, it would be the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened. But you live in Denver, right? Somewhere, Colorado?
Yeah, Colorado, outside of Colorado Springs. Yeah.
Okay. So you live outside of Colorado Springs, and that day that your son died, somebody else's daughter died, and somebody else had a brain aneurysm, and somebody else had some amazing, beautiful thing happen to them. The bottom line is these extraordinary things individually are very ordinary parts of the human experience, and all of us go through them. That's why I say the massive thing is coming for everybody. And that's not to be morbid. It's just to say that it's a fact. So if you want to build a resilient life, and you want to also find a repeatable process for what to do when you go through these big things, you need to start by saying, I'm not immune to this. Like this is possibly and likely going to happen. In fact, you don't know any 200-year-old people. And so that means that either you or your spouse, one of you is going to die before the other one does. So that massive thing is coming for you, unless you die in the car together, right? And then your kids have a massive thing of losing both their parents. So the bottom line is this, that I keep saying that, the bottom line, the result of it is this, that being aware of the fact that everybody goes through these things is step one. And step two is to say, okay, I can either just be aware of it, but then be completely blindsided by it when it happens to me, or I can try to build myself a system ahead of time for what I'm going to do when it does happen to me. Yeah. And that's when I realized we teach everybody how to do CPR, Kevin. We teach everybody how to change tires, but we don't teach anybody what are some tools you can use when something really bad happens in your life so you're not completely destroyed by them.
That building a system, I mean, that feels like the thing that I want to look at. I want to be becoming, as my good friend Randy would say, I want to be becoming the type of person that can withstand it, that can be resilient, even feel it completely, be devastated in a sense by it, but then to be the kind of person who can withstand it. Okay. Well, I do want to go into some of these aspects of the book, though. I also, just for my own benefit and for others, I want to, here's a little segment of the show here. Yeah. The worst things to say to somebody well, seriously, because to a lesser degree than you, but when my first son was born, he spent, we had a long journey. He had a little brain aneurysm at 5 days old, had a little seizure, and we took him in, and that caused hydrocephalus. And then he had epilepsy for a lot of his life. It was actually a status epilepticus, which was, if he had a seizure, it wouldn't stop. And then, we could say it 100 ways that a miracle happened. He grew out of it, whatever. But at the point of looking at surgery to remove the offending, section of his brain, he stopped having seizures. And
wow.
Yeah, great story. However, anyways, the point of that was that within that, the stuff that we heard from people, and I got to say, just because that was the culture that we were in, especially from the church, went from offensive to just ignorant But on the other side, though, when I find myself in those places, I know enough to be careful about what I say, but I still feel like, oh my, it's so, what on earth do you say to somebody?
Yeah.
But yeah, at the top of the list, is of the things of, everything, God works all things, out for good. Well, I wish he wouldn't have used this one,
Yeah.
to do such things. And yeah, what tops the list for you?
So yeah, there's some things that you should write down in your notes if you're journaling this episode, and you should never say them to somebody that's hurting. And number one is, especially when children die. I don't know why we do it, but we do. God needed another angel.
Yeah.
That's the worst possible thing. First of all, it's terrible theology. People don't become angels when they die. It's just not true. That's not what happens if you read the Bible. We don't become angels. And if God needed another angel, he would create another angel. He wouldn't take my son.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just a terrible thing to say. It's not true. Doesn't back up, not backed up with theology. Don't say that. Another thing is God needed him more than you did. I mean, the bottom line of that is, God's a big bully who's going to take my son because he needs him, and he doesn't think I need him. And God's got the whole universe. Like, why would he need my son instead of me having my son? Right. So don't say that. Again, bad theology, and really just some of the things that we say can actually injure people and create their own traumas and own set of grief that they have to think about. And so don't say that. I got a text message from somebody. So it's a new technological way that you can injure someone when they're grieving is by using emojis or slang. So somebody said, "I heard about your son, OMG," and then the face, like the scream face emoji. Like, I understand the sentiment, right? But it's like, can't you just like actually send me a text and tell me how sorry you are, or call me? Like, you have to send
irreverent,
OMG,
irreverent, yeah,
right? So those are silly things that I mean, it's funny to say, but it really happened, and when it does, it hurts. And so the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the Romans 8:28 idea, which is all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. So don't tell somebody God's going to work some good out of this, at least not early on. That there's a backstory to that ends up being true later on. But when you're in the acute phase of an injury, you don't need platitudes to try to make you feel better. You need people. My friend John Swanson, who's a hospital chaplain, says, show up and shut up. Like show up, put your hand on them, give them a hug, tell them it's hard. I know this is hard. And then just be quiet and let them tell you what they need to talk about. Right. I think that's helpful.
Well, thank you for that. That's, I really felt like that's a service to people to hear that. And because we so want to lift somebody's spirits. We want to help them. And it reminds me even of, Vienna Farron's book, The Origins, I'm sorry, not her book. I'm thinking of a different book of, Whitney Goodman's book, Toxic Positivity, where we want to come along and make it positive. And we can often do a lot of harm in that. Well, yeah, to the key core, of the book. I mean, so much of it, I wrote so many notes around it, Lee, just in the aspect too of what you said too, not to minimize what happened, but for you to say, I mean, how can we minimize that your child died of stabbings in the neck? We can't minimize that, but he's gone. You're left here. You're left here. His siblings are left here. And what matters is how they deal with that. And as you're saying, it goes around how we feel about that, which does come to that desire for what are all the words, reconciliation, justice, revenge. I mean, all the things that we do, and nothing changes the empty bed, the empty bedroom. Nothing changes that. And ultimately now we're just in a mind game to figure out how can we recover from this. And as you say, nothing changes what is. It's just how we feel about it. But people, especially people with the trauma to the degree that you endured, and especially at the beginning, that feels offensive, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. You're not ready for it yet. And I mean, understand too, the folks listening out there, this conversation that we're having is 10 years after this massive thing happened to me. And I wasn't having these conversations a month after, or a week after, or 6 months after, because you are grieving. And so first of all, give yourself permission to grieve. In fact, I think it's really critical that we say this, Kevin, I don't know if you're listening and you're a spiritual person or not, that this still is really relevant to you because you're going to go through these things, whatever your background or philosophy is. And all of us read and all of us study and all of us look at ancient literature or philosophers or Stoics or Mark Twain or somebody in the past that we read and learn from. And for me, it's just always been scripture. I use scripture. So I take a lot of lessons out of there, and some of them are in the book. But this isn't a conversation that we're having right now that's irrelevant to you if you're not a person, a believer. So here's a story that I want to tell you that's important to this. There's a guy in the Old Testament of the Bible named David who was a king, and he lost a son. And he lost his son because of his own actions, basically. And this would be relevant to you if you were driving drunk and you had a car wreck and your son died, or if something happened and your child died as a result of one of your actions. I had a friend who gave his son a bone marrow transplant when his son had leukemia, and the boy had an allergic reaction to the bone marrow and died. You imagine that? Like, it's not his fault, but he owned it like it was his fault, right? He had this horrible grief because he thought he killed his son with his own bone marrow, which is tragic. But in the Old Testament, in this story, the boy is dying, and it's pretty clear that he's going to die. And David is grieving, and he's praying, and he's fasting, and he's begging God to not make it so. And then the boy dies. And the next sentence in the book, is in the Bible, is he got up and washed his face and changed his clothes and asked for something to eat and went back to the business of being the king. And the guys, the advisors said, "What are you doing? Your son just died." And he said, "I can't change it now. I just got to get back to work." Basically, that's my paraphrase. Obviously, it's not the King James version. But so what happened after that in the story is that this guy's family becomes a disaster, Kevin. One of his sons rapes one of his daughters. Another one of his sons kills the other son in revenge for raping the daughter. The father has an estranged relationship with that son who murdered his other son, and that kid who did the murdering and is estranged from his father ends up trying to overthrow his dad and take over the kingdom. It's a nightmare. And if you look at it zoomed out to the 21st century and understanding what happens to trauma and how we grieve, that's a perfect story of the kinds of terrible things that happen to people that don't grieve properly and don't put their lives back together after something bad happens. So if you substitute, say, Lee Warren in 2013 and my son dies, and I decide to deal with that by going back to work and having a couple of bourbons every night, and I never really heal from it, then there's going to be some ripples of that trauma through my family for generations to come. Versus if I figure out a way to make it where I can heal from it or try to heal from it and put my life together in a way that my rest of my kids and family see me taking steps to recover from this thing, and they can follow me in doing that. That's going to tell a better story 3 or 4 generations from now than if I drink myself to death and my wife leaves me and I become this person who was just destroyed by this event, right? So you see the difference?
Yes, I do. I'm curious about grieving properly. I am a person who has not done a good job of being in touch with my emotions to begin with.
Yeah.
Never even felt like I was stuffing them. I just didn't have a place for them until I couldn't ignore them anymore. And so now now here I am trying to figure that out. Let me to exaggerate the concept a little bit. This was not the story. So Hal Elrod, a lot of people know Hal Elrod. He wrote a book called Miracle Morning.
Miracle Morning.
And they know him for that. Part of his story that I don't know if it's even that much of a focus of the book, I'm sure it's in the book, is that he was in an accident, got hit by a drunk driver, guy swerved over, and he's in bed being told he'll never walk again.
Yeah.
That's the diagnosis. And he shares that in his life prior to that, back to what you talked about, kind of building a system, he had been building a system just in regards to negative thoughts and kind of the 5-minute rule type thing. Okay, something bad happened. I'm going to be really irritated for 5 minutes and then I'm going to go on. Well, he had really been, that had been his life. So now this massive thing, as you would say, happens to him. He's in the hospital and he's just kind of going, this sucks. But you know, I got a life to live, and goes on to the point where the doctors told his parents, I think he's not quite right. He's not dealing with
Yeah.
this right. And I think it was his dad finally came to him and said, man, the docs think that you're not dealing with this well because you're just being happy go lucky. He said, Dad, I have been training for this for a long time. And I know that sitting here and wallowing in it is just not going to help me. If I'm going to have any hope of anything good, I'm just going to go on. So that's an exaggerated point because it's, every trauma is not different. Every massive thing or is not the same. I'm sorry. And
Right.
so I don't want to minimize anything here, but play with that as far as grieving properly.
Well, I think, first of all, it's really important to say this. I keep putting disclaimers out. We're having this conversation 10 years later.
Yeah.
But that being said, we have a societal familiarity with this 5 stages of grief from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that everybody knows: denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance, right? Or depression, acceptance. And the problem is we've culturalized that model that Kubler-Ross came up with. And we've tried to tell people, okay, well, you're in denial now. Oh, now you're in anger. Now you're in, and we say, oh, well, that stage shouldn't last more than 6 weeks. Or, we try to put parameters around this. Here's the truth is, she didn't write that about what to do after your mom dies, or what to do after your husband leaves you, or what to do after the pandemic destroys your family business and you're penniless and homeless. She didn't write that to talk about that kind of grief. She wrote it specifically was her research on people who find out that they're dying and what happens to them. And so the 5 stages of grief were specifically developed as sociological look at what happens to people who know they're dying and what do they do next. They deny it first, they become angry about it, they start bargaining with God, they get really depressed and sad, and then they finally accept it. But it doesn't apply very well to grief that happens to you from other things. It's similar, but my point about this is, don't put yourself in this pressure cooker of thinking that you're not progressing through the stages properly, or thinking that one stage is taking you too long. Because the truth is, what I've experienced, and I'm seeing it with all of our kids and family members, and Lisa and I both, is you go back and forth. Like, you'll be super angry one day. And this happened to me 3 months ago. I just woke up one day and I was really mad that my son died. I'm just mad. I don't want to be guy that lost his son. It happened. I'll tell you what happened. Somebody got married about his age that we were friends with. They got an invitation, and I thought, I'm never going to know what his kids look like. I'm never going to know what kind of woman he would have married. I don't get to see that. And I got really mad. I just got myself in this real grumpy, angry state. And what that means is that you're going to grieve over losing somebody or whatever it is. You're going to grieve in some way for the rest of your life about that. And you'll come in and out of it, and it becomes this different thing over time, but you're going to grieve for the rest of your life. So how do you grieve well? And I think that the long-winded answer to your very short question is this: that to grieve well means to give yourself permission that it takes as long as it takes, and that it's really not an ending process. There won't be a time when it's really over, because you'll still always be sad about that. So understand that it takes a long time. Understand that it's okay to go back and forth from one stage to another, because those stages weren't really ever defined for that particular model in the first place. And understand that everybody around you in your family and in your world is also grieving. And so there's times and days when, in the early phase, when I'm really pretty okay somehow, inexplicably, and Lisa's having a really bad moment, right? And what'll happen then is I'll get sucked into her bad moment, and it'll turn into one of mine. Or sometimes I can help her pull up into a better moment. And so it's dynamic, it's familial, it's individual, but also relativistic at the same time. And it's just this murky, labyrinthine process. So how do you do it well? You give yourself permission to take the time that it takes. You give yourself permission to go back and forth. You make sure you have a covenant with yourself not to let somebody else define what that process ought to be for you. And that's something that's going to happen to you. I promise you. Somebody's going to come along in 6 months or a year and say, shouldn't you be over that by now? They may not say it specifically, but that's the message, right? Is Why are you still sad about that? It happened 2 years ago. And if you've been through something like a divorce or something like where somebody didn't die, that's pretty common. I think people put some pressure on you. You need to get back out there. You need to do your thing. You need to get over this. That happened a long time ago. You should be okay with it by now. And so don't put yourself in that kind of pressure, because this process is a lifelong process, and you will progress through it if you find yourself a good plan and a good path. But nobody else can define it for you.
There's probably on the other side as well, that if you are dealing with it well, that somebody's going to be offended that you're dealing with it well, especially when they are.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And it's interesting that you said, shouldn't you get over it? I mean, that's part of one of the, let me go down to the headlines of your book. Part 1, when the thing happens that you never get over. And that just stuck out to me, because as you talked about, your son died, that changed you forever. You will never get over it. You're not supposed to get over it.
Nope.
It's not helping us, that perspective. I even look at that, Lee, in the aspect of overcoming. You're supposed to overcome whatever, your weakness, your fear, your whatever. And as I've gone on, I finally kind of let go of that, at least the concept of overcoming, that it's not eradicating it. I don't think I'm ever going to be rid of that, whatever, that fear, that weakness. Now, I hopefully overcome it in learning how to be resilient or how to manage it and get the results I want anyways, but I didn't do it by eradicating or erasing that thing, because I don't think I ever can. Is that fair?
Absolutely fair. You can't get over it. One of my daughters, Kaylin, she was still in high school when Mitch died, and she had to go back to school. She had to graduate high school. And there was a day when she said, she was looking at a picture of her brother, and I was standing behind her, and I heard her say it to him, like she was talking to him. And she said, I have to carry on with my life, but I'll never move on from you.
Wow.
And it was just like, boom, this little girl, my 15-year-old, 16-year-old daughter, just said something so profound that it's become like a mantra in our family. Like, we are carrying on with our lives, Mitch, but we won't ever move on from that moment. And that's kind of one of those quantum physics things. So in quantum physics, the nerds, the smart people that understand that stuff, there's quantum physicists don't think brain surgeons are very smart, by the way. They look down on us like, oh, you're doctors. You don't know very much. So the quantum physicists have discovered that at the quantum level, when you get compressed things down to the very small, the subatomic particles of the universe, that an electron can basically behave as if it's in two places at the same time. And it's impossible with our math and our understanding of it. You can't be in two places at one time, but an electron can. They can detect it doing stuff in two different places at the same time, what that means is it is possible for you to have something devastating and life-altering that you will never get over, and it's possible for you to have a purposeful, meaningful life that can include words like happiness and joy again at the same time. Those two things become true over time. And what happens after massive loss or massive pain or whatever it is you're going through, and sometimes it's not one massive thing, it's a whole lifetime of little water torture, little things that you feel like you're never going to be okay because your life just keeps going the wrong way. But at first, the electron seems to be in one place, and it seems impossible that two things can be true. And it just seems, I'm always going to be sad. I'm never going to be okay. I'm always going to be broken. I'm never going to get over this. But over time, you start being able to separate the testability of those two truths and find out that they really are both true. That, okay, there's a way that I can get my life to where Mitch's story is a part of it, and it's a devastating part of it, and it's a pivot point for us, our families. It's a new creation story. It's a new beginning for us. But at the same time, our life can still have value and meaning and purpose, and that's how I think that's part of grieving well is to get to that place where you can say, this is going to be a thing that happened in our family. Not, it's a devastating thing. It's a horrible thing. It's an unsurvivable thing, but it's not going to be the thing that happens in our life, because we still have children, we still have grandchildren, we still have a life, we have a marriage, we have a business, we have, all these other things that God's called us to in our lives. And that just can't be the thing. It has to be a thing.
Well, and just to give credit back to what we talked about again, and if you're hearing this and if you have the big trauma that's happened to you or is going to, and you feel like, well, I don't have all those things that Lee has, that he talks about, that those are things that are ahead of you that are still to live for. And I do want to ask about grieving. I'm trying to think how to say it because I am not trying to justify, the grieving. I mean, I think there can be redemption in anything. Thank goodness for that. But I don't know if I would choose the massive trauma just for the redemption of it. That's my preface to pulling out something that you had in the book. And I'm going to pull it out. It's 2 Bible verses, again, which I believe that regardless of your faith belief, you folks as listeners, that it's highly relevant. But this is out of the Bible. You pulled out John 16:33. God promised that in this world we would have trouble. And I want to add on to that. We would have grieving, things to grieve. We would have grief. And then pair that with John 10:10. God promised that he came into the world to enable us to have abundant lives. So my point is pairing the trouble with the abundance in the aspect, trouble, grieving in the aspects of you've got me thinking about this, Lee. Is the level of abundance that I am able to experience even possible without a certain level of trouble and grieving?
I don't think so. I think if you somehow managed to live a charmed life and you never had anything bad happen to you and you died in your sleep at 100, I think your life wouldn't be as rich. And that sounds weird because I don't mean to say that losing my son has enriched my life. I don't mean that at all. But it's one of these quantum physics things where this can be tails and this can be heads, and they're both true at the same time.
Yeah.
The coin lands on its side somehow. So what I'm trying to say is, I think you remember the biodome? It sounds like a random tangent, but it's not. That back in the 80s or 70s and 80s, they had this biodome, this experiment where they put people inside this controlled atmosphere, and they were going to try to see if they could build kind of an Earth-like environment on another planet or something. So they put these guys in there for 2 years, and they had all kinds of problems. And one of the things that they had problems with was they could grow plants, but the trees would get to a certain size and they would die. It would fall over. And they figured out that the reason the trees weren't able to sustain their own weight in that environment is because there was no wind. And they figured out that the wind is what gave the little trees resilience and strength as they got bigger. Wow. And that trees that had never been exposed to wind didn't have any ability to tolerate gravity. And I think that's the answer to your question.
That's brilliant.
That if we live a life that was never challenged, we would never understand what a real life is.
Okay, I'm sitting here typing. That's a mic drop moment. I'm not done yet, but that's a mic drop moment. I love that, and I remember the biodome. I don't remember that story. It makes complete sense. I mean, we know that if you support a tree, my grandpa taught me that you take a tree and support it, it doesn't get strong. I didn't think about it in regards to wind, turbulence, trouble, grief. I want you to play with me with, you call it that massive thing. We talk about trauma, and we often these days, it's the verbiage around it is big T trauma and little t trauma. Losing your son to knife wounds in the neck would be a big T trauma, no doubt.
Yeah.
And then you've got the little t trauma. I'm going to try again. This is such a sensitive topic. This is probably the most stuttering show I've ever done because you don't want to offend anybody because it's so difficult. And, I think we tend to, want to support people, and whatever your trauma is relevant. Obviously sometimes it's not a life altering trauma. And there may be some times where we get into victim mode too quick with something that, in essence, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But to the point of this, when you talk about that massive thing, are you being inclusive of the big T and the little T thing? I mean, 'cause somebody's out there there's a kid out there who had their heart set on Harvard and they are not going to go after all these years. It is not going to happen. They cannot do anything else. It's a flat out no. And it's devastating. Now we would call that a first world
Absolutely.
problem that they can even, have the opportunity to go to college at all. But they didn't get into Harvard. Oh, woe's me. But it's something that they had their heart set on. We don't need to minimize, doesn't help anything to, and they are devastated. It is a massive trauma that could derail them the rest of their life. They could go forward thinking, I am a failure or life is unfair. And we're back to the meaning that we attribute it to. So is that a fair depiction of how you are looking at this massive thing that we all have them? And then we all have the ability to feel as we feel about them.
Absolutely. And there's so much to unpack in that question. First of all, I want to make it clear here that I am a brain surgeon. I am not a therapist or a grief expert, and I'm not trying to tell you what your grief's going to look like. I'm trying to show you what it was like for me.
I would cite you as a grief expert, but I get the
well, I'm not the guy that writes the book
right.
about how you recover from grief.
Yeah.
I only said that to say this, like, I try to discern. I want you to discern, friend, wherever you are listening to hear us in the world right now, discern the fact that whatever pain you're feeling is your pain, and whatever hard thing that you're going through or have gone through is your thing. And just because there's somebody next to you that had something worse happen to them, your grief is not relative to somebody else's. In fact, there's a law of physics, the law of gas diffusion, where if you put a gas in a room, it expands to fill the entire space, or the smallest container or biggest container that you can put it in. And that's why that you can put a rotten egg in the kitchen and you'll smell it in the whole house eventually. You know exactly what that smells like. It's also why you can smell your mom's perfume from down the hall, because those gases expand. And that's kind of what I see about grief in my mind. Like, whatever your trauma is, whatever your pain was, it's going to fill you up for a while. And you can see your example about somebody not getting into Harvard. You could also probably look at 40-year-old alcoholics, and a subset of them will be guys that thought they were going to play in the NFL and they tore their ACL in high school and it never happened. Right? So the death of a dream is a very legitimate trauma. It's absolutely devastating to some people. And if you can't pivot, like we said earlier, like for me, like it could be the thing that happened in my life, or it can be a thing that happened in my life. And so you got to be able to grieve properly and heal from it, but also still find meaning and purpose and pain and passion and joy and happiness and all those other things in the rest of your life. So I think, yeah, absolutely. Small t trauma is not small t if you're the sufferer. Or in surgery, people say, well, is this a minor procedure? And I say, well, every procedure that somebody else is having is a minor procedure, and every procedure that I'm having is a major procedure.
So to look at that, not judge it, would you say? Not judge the pain. The pain's a pain. You feel it, not minimize it, not judge it, and allow that. Give yourself permission to grieve that. But then we are into how to grieve that. Well, obviously we all want to be able to have a level of resilience and go forth. And to that, so now I want to jump to that other aspect too. Yeah, because I don't like the perspective of justifying the trauma because of the redemption, even though I love the redemption. And I look at that and go, John, Lee, you would likely not be here on this show helping me, helping a lot of other people without the death of Mitch. It gave you, what would you say? It gave you strength. It gave you insight. It gave me
some purpose. And I'll tell you, I can exactly unpack that for you. So before Mitch died, I was a neurosurgeon, and my life was defined by, my faith in Jesus and my family and all that was my identity. But if you said, who's Lee Warren? I would say, oh, I'm a neurosurgeon. That's what I did. That's what I was known by. After we lost Mitch, I really don't even know how it came about, but it started being this mission of mine to send an email to my kids and my family every day to try to encourage them in some way. And that led to people sharing it. And it kind of like it happened when I wrote Home from Iraq. It started getting shared around and people started reading it. And that happened with my grief, kind of my, how we're going to get through this together kind of notes to my kids. Is it became this newsletter that became a podcast, that all this, because I realized at some point that when you're in this really dark place and you find a little bit of light, somebody behind you needs you to reach behind and grab their hand and help them find it too. And Lisa and I talked about it a lot, and we were equipped to talk about it. We understood I understood the neuroscience of what my brain was doing to me when I was grieving. And I just felt this mission to honor Mitch by helping other people make it a little bit farther down the path after they'd lost somebody or had gone through something hard. So I think that's part of it. It definitely became motivating for me to make my life something more than I could be as just a neurosurgeon. Because I realized I can help. I'm going to do 350 surgeries this year, right? So if I do 30 years of neurosurgery, I'm going to do 10,000 operations or whatever. And that's the sum total of the people I can help with my hands. But if I can put something out there in this podcast that your people are listening to, or in a book, I might be able to help 1 million people or 10 million people. And so I thought, well, what would Mitch be proudest of? He'd be really proud that I did a bunch of good surgeries, but he would be really proud that if I helped somebody from killing themselves because I gave them a little bit of hope.
In that, yeah, again, not to justify the thing, but it is redemptive that so again, whatever that massive thing, whatever that trauma is, that thing to grieve, that it only comes by proxy of wanting something, kind of back to that expectations. So if you don't want to grieve anything, if you don't want any trauma, then don't want anything. Stay in your home, stay safe. Don't do it. The moment you want something, you have the ability to be disappointed, or the moment you walk out your door, you have the ability to be a victim, to become hurt in some way. So if you're going to do that, something's going to happen to you. We're not going to justify that, but I really don't like the word should. What's a better word? But it should, in essence, help me if there's a better way to say it. It should enable you to. A byproduct is it enables you with something you wouldn't have had otherwise that you can use. That's a redemptive thing. That doesn't mean it's a redemption that justifies it. But
that's right.
Okay.
I think I think this refining is a word. I realized when I read that passage in Isaiah where it says, I'm going to put you in the furnace of suffering. Like, I realized, like, you actually, if you think about it that way, grief or pain or the loss of a dream or whatever you want to call it, your big or little t trauma. Again, I don't think anybody has a little t trauma from their own perspective, but if you look at it, you say this feels, even just look at the neurochemistry of it. What happens when you're really hurting? It feels like you're on fire. It feels like you're going crazy. It feels like your mind's going to explode. Your heart's racing, your mouth is dry, and you just feel out of control, right? You feel devastated. And you feel those things because your brain is doing something to you. But what happens over time is you realize at some point, I got to get this under control, and I got to figure out how to heal from this, or it is going to destroy me. And so I said, if I'm in this furnace of suffering, it's either going to burn me up or it's going to refine me in some way. And I want to be refined by it. And that's where I came up with that thought about the your brain on drugs. Remember those commercials from the 80s? Like, you would watch MTV and they would show this skillet and they would say, this is your brain. And then they would crack an egg and say, this is, or the skillet is, your brain, and the egg is your drugs. And this is your brain on drugs. And they would watch the egg fry up and your brain's all fried to a crisp. And I thought of that as a metaphor of like trauma is the skillet. And your brain gets thrown in there, your life gets thrown in there, and it's going to cook you up. And you have a choice. You can get pulled out of the skillet when it's a a fried egg that somebody could eat and still has some value, some nutrition, or some purpose, or it can just sit in there and cook so long that it's just burned up and charred up and it's just useless and burned and killed. And so I think that that's a pretty good word picture, a pretty good sight picture of when trauma puts you in the skillet or puts you in the furnace, you got to get out of there at some point, but you're not going to be like you were before you went in there, Kevin. You're going to be changed by it. It's going to chemically alter you. It's going to change the arc of the rest of your life. It's going to change your family. Like I said earlier, one of your kids doesn't wake up tomorrow. You now have 8 and not 9. Your family's going to be different than it was before. No matter how well you grieve, no matter how much you change or how sad you are about it, your family's going to be different. And so this process, redemption is a good word. It doesn't take anything away from the people that suffer things when they find another way forward to find purpose. I think adding that thought process of the person I lost or the person I thought I was going to be, that there was going to be this NFL player or whatever, that person would want me to still be the best person I could be in this life, still tell the best story I could tell in this life, still do the most good I can do in this life. And that's what's redemption. That's what's refining. And who wants to say this thing happened and it destroyed me when they could instead say this thing happened and I found a way forward and it's part of me, but I'm a better person than I was. I think that's the bottom line. I'm a better person than I was before Mitch died. And I'm a better person because I'm trying to make him proud of me.
Okay. That's a better way of that helps wrap that up, that aspect up a little bit. Cause I was sitting here thinking, look at some stuff and go, whatever it is that sucked, but I might as well get something out of it. Some redemption, refining, but that you're a better person. I remember having John O'Leary on the show years ago. He's folks, if you don't know, his first book was called On Fire. He was burnt, like 99% of his body. No way he should have lived. And he did. And I asked him the question. I don't know I can't remember what the preface that got me to ask the question, but if you had to go back in time all over, what would you do? And he says, I would be burned up. I had a really hard time accepting that. And I'm still going to put that off as a unique thing because there's a lot of the things that have happened in my life that I wouldn't even say are that traumatic necessarily. But I would not choose, even with the redemption, I would not choose those things to have happened. But I am grateful for the redemption. I hope we've done justice to the book, folks. There's a lot to get into. I think, out of the 5 parts, I feel like we've played around in 2 of them. So, go get the book. If you want to increase your hope, go get the book. But I do want to land on one more. And this is a quote out of it. Trauma doesn't define us. Our choices we make after the trauma do. You wrote that. And I was curious about the word choices. I think I have used in place of that, the trauma doesn't define us, our experience around it, how we take it, which you said, and our beliefs around as a result of it. But use the word choices. And I'm going to ask you to unwrap that a little bit.
Well, I think it again, we touched on 2 parts, and the choice part comes later when I teach you something that I call self-brain surgery. And the basic premise is this, and self-brain surgery is a funny thing to say if you're not familiar with neurosurgery, but the fact is you can actually change how your brain works by changing how you think. And you literally can change every cell in your body and the generations after you by thinking about different things. That's a whole nother story. But the choice piece comes in this. You have to realize it's a buzzword right now. Almost everybody's saying, think about your thinking, think about the things that you think about. And what happens after trauma is trauma tells you it will never be different than this. You can never overcome this. You can never survive this. This is all your fault, whatever those things are that you hear. All of us have that negative voice in our head, as Dan Harris says. What happens is you have to make 3 decisions. You have to make 3 decisions if you want to recover from trauma well and be okay. And these are choices that you have to make. Number one, you have to decide to believe the fact from neuroscience that feelings are not facts. Because your brain makes you feel a bunch of things, and feelings point to stuff that may or may not be true, right? You feel fear and you think it's because there's a bear coming down your hall, but there's not really a bear. It's just somebody banged into a pot or something. But the neurochemical trigger makes you feel the same thing as if there really was a bear, right? But it's not true. So feelings aren't facts. Feelings point to things that may or may not be true. And so you have to decide that that's a true statement, because after major things happen, you're going to feel a lot of things, and a lot of them are demotivating or devastating or depressing, or will make you want to drink yourself into a coma. A lot of those feelings, my life's never going to be okay. I'm not a good dad. My wife's going to leave me because this happened. Those things usually aren't true. So number one, feelings aren't facts. That's a choice you have to make, Kevin, to know that that's the fact. Feelings are not always facts. Number two, 5-1, the thoughts that you think are generally not facts. They're generally not true, and they're generally overly negative. So you have the decision-making power to choose to think different thoughts than the ones that pop into your head. And after grief, that's incredibly important. To learn how to take control, 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, take captive every thought. Don't be a victim of the things that pop into your head. And especially, I can tell you, after your son dies, you're going to think a lot of thoughts. And most of them are going to be, I should have been there. I could have done something. I don't know why I didn't see it coming. How could I have been such a bad father? This is my fault. None of that stuff is true. You have to learn how to acknowledge that not every thought you think is true. I call it the thought biopsy, because I'm a brain surgeon, so I'm always biopsying stuff and looking at it under the microscope. And if you told me you had a headache, I would say, well, it's probably a brain tumor. Let's go to operate. Let's go take you to surgery and cut your head open and get in there. You would say, wait, time out. Right. Shouldn't you do a scan, or shouldn't you gather some data before you make the decision on what to do next? I just told you a symptom and you're telling me you want to do brain surgery. That'd be crazy. It'd be malpractice, right? So the truth is, when a surgeon wants to know whether something's bad or good or cancer or benign, they'd biopsy it. And that's how I see this getting your thoughts under control idea. So look at it critically before you respond to it. And after trauma, all your thoughts go crazy. So that's the second decision. Feelings aren't facts. Not every thought is true. The third one is, you have to relentlessly decide that you're not going to do things. Hear me, friend, this is important. After you lose somebody, after this massive thing happens, you're going to want to numb yourself to the pain. You're going to want to develop some behaviors and habits to make yourself not think about it. People use alcohol, they use drugs, they use sex, they use gambling. They do all kinds of things to try not to feel it. But all of that is malpractice against yourself. Because at the end of the day, you will not heal, and you will not recover, and you will not begin moving forward until you make a decision that you're not going to participate in your own demise. You can't, like my friend said, you can't have a 200% mortality rate from one death. And that's where I would leave it. That the choice piece is that you have the agency and you have the power. And by the way, the scientific definition of hope, the people who research hope, they define it as having agency, which is the ability to do something about the situation you're in, and pathways, which is the legitimate way that you can move forward and find the way to get from here to there. Hope is the ability to the belief that you can get there from here. So if you have agency and pathways, those are the choices that you have to make, that you can get better. It is possible because other people have gotten better. And hope is repeatable and reliable if you learn to make those three decisions and then make the choice to move towards it.
That's a great way to wrap it up. Folks, if you want to tune in to just what he said, to hope and finding more agency and a pathway, I very much encourage you to get the new book that's sitting over my shoulder here on the video. Hope is the First Dose, a new book by Dr. Lee Warren, and it is going to be a top shelf book of mine, along with the last book that you're on the show for, Lee, which is I've Seen the End of You. And we'll also really encourage you guys to tune in to Lee's podcast, the Dr. Lee Warren podcast, which I think I'm going to be fortunate enough to be on with you soon. It'll be fun to continue this conversation. Lee, man, thank you for coming back. Thank you for the work you have done to be refined by something that could have been the end of you. I'm grateful.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate you. It's an honor to be back with you.
Friends, this is part 1 with Lee Warren. Following this episode will be my values and habits episode. And Lee and I get even further into deep but hopeful water. Lee's book again is Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. And you can find Lee at his website. Look for Lee Warren. Friends, thank you for tuning into Self-Helpful, where I curate the sea of new personal development materials and help you integrate wisdom into your life, because we all want to elevate our own experience and improve the way we show up for others.